what many did not get right was Ukraine's ability to carry out a counteroffensive over the summer of last year. Hopes were high because of the preceding Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, but unfortunately Ukraine was not able to break through and sever the land bridge to Crimea. I would like to give the first question to Daniel Davis, since calling out self-deception during war has become your mark of distinction. So I would like to ask you, to what extent has the West and Ukraine been deceiving themselves about a total victory? Do we have some indications today whether the Western intelligence actually believed the counteroffensive would work? And was there a mismatch between declared ends and means?
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get to discuss in this really great forum here. I love anything that has to do with diplomacy and things searching towards peace. And that's something that's desperately needed. There's way too much focus on just military and just kinetics and not enough on actually diplomacy and finding peace. So I'm a big advocate of this kind of forum. Yes, I do believe, and I wrote it months before this offensive started, that it had absolutely no chance of success. Only the most outlier of possibility of a success. In fact, the only way I argued that it would have had any chance would have been if the Russian forces just collapsed and turned and ran. And I mean, you can never completely exclude that as a possibility, but it was so remote that by any rational analysis, a sober analysis, the offensive just had really no chance of all success. And the reasons are very self-evident. It's not some deep, knowledge that only somebody who's done a lot of this can figure out. If you have even a general level of knowledge, I think that it could have been self-evident, because we knew ahead of time that the Ukraine side had insufficient air power, very limited air defense. They did not have a trained, mechanized force. They didn't have a coherent set of kit, meaning tanks, infantry carriers, artillery pieces, even local air defense capacity that were coherent, and they had a logistics system to support it, and they had trained people to keep it running, and they had a supply system to keep the spare parts flowing, and all of the things that are necessary that make combat power. And they didn't have the experience in the troop levels at the different levels, platoon, company, battalion, brigade level, and even at the strategic level. They just didn't have experience in how to conduct those kinds of very complicated combined arms maneuver. And they didn't have sufficient mine clearing equipment. That might have been the biggest Achilles heel of all. All those things were well known before the thing went off. And yet I was really shocked, frankly, to hear the Washington Post about a month ago published a series of articles that looked into the preparation and then the conduct of that operation, that summer offensive. And then they explained in there that many of the Pentagon leaders actually thought there was a 50-50 shot this could have gotten all the way to the Azov coast, which was the declared objective of this, to cut the land bridge and all that for the Russians and make their hold on the rest of the war of the territory untenable. I couldn't believe that anybody who had served any time in the U.S. Army would have believed that. Because look, I started off my career in Europe during the Cold War in the 1980s. I was a cavalry officer in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, who at the time was an active patrolling of the east and west borders during the Cold War. So I did lots of maneuver across terrain just like this in a mechanized organization. We trained all kinds of, like up to 200 days a year in the field, training for these kind of things, studying the Russian army and the Soviet army, how they fight, etc. So I knew what they were composed of. I knew what it takes to both do an offense and a defense. I fought in armored mechanized warfare in Iraq in 1991. I became a second in command of a cavalry squadron in the 1st Armored Division in Europe in the early 2000s. So I had a lot of direct experience, practical and studying, that should have showed that this had no chance of success. But people didn't want to believe that. They didn't want to listen to it. They wanted to say, no, it'll work, even though they couldn't tell you why they thought it would work. They just wanted it to. And therein, I think, is one of the biggest problems that this war has suffered in the West, is that there is this aspirational thinking. We want this outcome to succeed. We say that Russia is evil and they're bad for doing these things. So The Ukraine side should win. Obviously, we want them to win because Ukraine was invaded. I mean, they were clearly the victims in this situation, and there's no question about that. But you also have to base policies on what's realistically possible. So we can want an outcome. We can think that it's right morally, but if you can't make it happen, then to pursue that outcome when you don't have the means to accomplish it and the other side does have the means to thwart it, then you're setting yourself up for disaster. And I think that's exactly what we've done. We meaning the West, but primarily Ukraine, has embarked on a course of action that can't succeed either tactically or strategically. All they're doing is losing more and more men. And I think if they don't change policies and seek a negotiated solution while they have as much territory as they do, they're going to keep losing men, and eventually they're going to lose more territory.
Right. I would like then to give the next question to Gustav Gressel, maybe also commenting some of the issues that Daniel Davis brought up. You have also followed the development of the battlefield closely. Was there something about Russia's defense capability that Western observers were unable to grasp? Did we have too strong confidence in NATO tactics and Western weapons? I remember 1 year ago, the big mantra in the West was, we just need to train Ukrainians in combined warfare. Then there's a good chance that they might succeed. How do you assess the situation?
Well, I would say that that's done with. That might have worked in 2022, but it doesn't work in 2023 because the war looks different than Fulda in 1985. Which just contradicts some of the points made before. So Ukraine actually had made quite coherent offensives. Previously, you mentioned Kharkiv, Kherson, but also Sumy, Kiev, the battles there. There were extensive mechanized battles. Superiority of fires on both sides is achieved predominantly through artillery, not air force. And there was a superiority in fires at the time held by Ukraine. Now, the problem with that was Ukraine compounded in the preparation of the offensive, compounded a lot of problems into one. Creating new brigades, if you have new teams that are set up, new commanders, those usually need time to get used to each other. Also, with a mobilized army, you have very different stages of training and preparation, depending from where you mobilize people from. When did they have their last military training as an officer or NCO, especially as Ukraine conducted a lot of defense reforms in the past. So you have a very incoherent military tradition, and a guy that has observed officers class in 1995 is a different officer than one who graduated in 2015. And on top of that, they were equipped with new equipment that also needed different tactics and different procedures and different logistics, and sort of the technical transitioning to other equipment was compounded with creating new army, new brigades and new formations. That stalled the thing on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, it was a bit of an uncharted territory. Yes, there were tactical obstacles, but the prime thing that really defines a defensive is the troops defending technical obstacles, because technical obstacles slow the enemy down, but to kill them, you need troops defending them. And the Russian troops defending them did considerably better at a lot of jobs that the Russian army had deep problems during the winter offensive in 2022 to 2023. Air-to-ground cooperation is one thing, but also synchronizing forces. They did much better there. They had, of course, more time to prepare and to rehearse what they're doing. And so this ended up the way it is. There were planning mistakes, maybe on the Ukrainian side. If more seasoned units like the 3rd Assault Brigade would have been shifted into the center of gravity, things might have played out differently. However, I think that general mistake the West in its backers did was to believe that the counteroffensive would settle the war, which, even if it went good, would not have settled the war. It would have shortened the line Ukraine need to defend in the next winter, which of course would make defending easier, but still this was a line from where a war of attrition would continue. And there was insufficient planning on what to do on the day thereafter. And this is haunting us now.
So the question is why the Ukrainians would, if there were problems and they knew there were these kind of problems that you mentioned, why would they agree. They are paying human lives which the West are not doing. Why would they agree to such a counteroffensive? There was some doubt about, a big doubt about whether it would work out.
Well, the Ukrainians thought they could manage better setting up these brigades. They had quite a high confidence in them. The second thing is, as again, the Russian army that stumbled into the winter offensive had so many tactical problems that they underestimated the enemy. Plus, then at the end of the day, delivery of some items and munitions delayed. Mine clearing equipment was already touched upon. And that basically compounded things. I mean, at the end of the day, the Russians had moved operative reserves into the area to keep the line. You don't, especially the best land formations that the Russian army can muster, the 76th Airborne and the 7th Airborne, you don't commit these reserves to battle unless you're really sure that you really need to do that, unless you want to risk something. So I think now, of course, that the thing has failed, everybody knew that the thing had to fail, and we have a lot of sort of projections into that, but it was actually closer than it might look today.
Right. I'd like to give the next question to Jeffrey Mankoff. I see you were nodding also on Gustav's comment about the war would not end with a successful counter-offensive. Given your extensive research on Russia and Russian foreign policy, did we underestimate the extent to which Russia was willing to sacrifice human lives to meet its objectives in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just start off by saying that I'm speaking on my own behalf and that my views don't reflect those of my employer, the Defense Department of the U.S. government. I do think on some level that we have underestimated the Russians, and of course the Ukrainians' successes in various early stages of the war, the successful defense of Kiev, the liberation of Kharkiv and Kherson have already been touched upon. But I think that did provide a somewhat misleading impression of Russian capabilities, especially on the defensive, which is what we're talking about here. And I think also that there's a political element to all of this. I think the Russian strategy is predicated to a significant degree on being able to outlast not just the Ukrainians, but also the West. And that has been a concern that has motivated Western policy in this conflict from the beginning. So I think we had a kind of political imperative to want to allow the Ukrainians to do something that was going to bring the war to a relatively quick conclusion. And so I think there was a little bit of, maybe you could call it magical thinking, both in how effective the counteroffensive would be operationally, but also what its strategic impact would be in terms of ending the war, because we haven't wanted to contemplate what a long war would look like, because both of the political calendar in the United States and in several European countries as well, but also just because of the general trend that support for military intervention, and even if it's not our intervention, but for being involved in supporting and sustaining the Ukrainians, that kind of support, if we look at the history of the last several decades, tends to wane over time. And so I think we really wanted to believe that there was a quick way to end this war, and we may have drunk a little bit of the Kool-Aid ourselves when it comes to planning and thinking about what the counteroffensive would look like. And the fact that the Russians really did kind of collapse on the front at Kharkiv, I think fed into a narrative that we were building about Russian incompetence, the corruption within the command structures, the inability of the different units to work together, that led us to believe that it only was going to take this one big push in the south to be able to cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea, and that then if that happened, all kinds of magical things would then follow on. But I think the reality is, one, this was always going to be a very tough fight. I'm not convinced that it was doomed from the beginning, but I think that, it was never something that was going to be an easy or automatic success. And there are plenty of things that we did and didn't do that probably could have tipped the balance at least a little bit. But even in the case that it had been more successful, right, the Russians were still going to be holding on in large parts of eastern Ukraine. There's still the problem of Crimea, and I know the objective was ultimately to cut off access to Crimea. But given the centrality that Crimea has taken on in the Putin regime's sort of legitimation strategy, I think it was going to be very, very hard to convince them to pull back from Crimea. But the reality is, given the scale of Russian resources, human, material, and otherwise, and the fact that they've got an economy that's basically mobilized to go to war, this was always going to be a longer war than we wanted it to be. Now, I'm not convinced that Putin is right and that Russia is better placed to fight a long war, certainly given the economic disparities between Russia on the one hand and the US and its European allies on the other. I think if this does become a protracted conflict of where economic capacity and the ability to regenerate forces is really the determining factor. It's not clear to me that gives Russia an advantage, but I do think that that's the kind of war that we're fighting. This is not a war that's going to be decided by one sort of quick strike, the retaking of a certain piece of territory, right? It's going to be a long, grinding, mid-20th century style conflict. And I don't know that the political leadership in the United States or in a lot of Europe has prepared their populations for the reality that that's the kind of war that this is and always was going to be.
Thank you. I would like to give the next question then to Suzanne. Loftus. You have spent both time in the United States and in Europe. What would you believe were the Western motivation for encouraging Ukraine to undertake to undertake this costly counteroffensive? And do you believe there was a discrepancy between the hope for victory and the military means that the West provided Ukraine?
Hi, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question, of course. Lots of good points were already made on this, but I would have to just add a few things. That the motivation was clearly to try and make important battlefield gains and place Ukraine in a position where it could have some leverage or, be in a favorable position at a possible negotiations. I wouldn't say that the expectations were total victory at this stage, though. Perhaps just a meaningful battlefield victory, very much like we saw in 2022. But indeed, like many of us said, it was highly optimistic and rather unrealistic, given both the difficult defense lines to penetrate that the Russians have in place, but also on the fact that there seemed to have been lots of miscalculations on how effectively the Ukrainians could conduct these combined armed operations that we are such big fans of in America, and the terrain, the difficulty of the terrain, the mines, and not to mention drones, making the battlefield completely transparent, or almost the case. There was also an issue with how much training was involved. It's we overestimated to have that these training sessions were kind of long and effective enough, when really actually they were not. And then, of course, Ukrainians have their own structural issues with their forces. Many are a little older than they should be, not in the best shape. And that should also probably be one of the lessons learned for any future counteroffensives. But the Russians appeared to have also adapted to many of our weapons, and this is partially because of this incremental approach, this drip approach of, sending in a weapon and talking about it for weeks. And, it's there wasn't a lot of privacy or secrecy or element of surprise on that. And it's true that the weapons delivery was not at the level that it was asked for. And in that sense, there was a discrepancy, to answer your question. Many critics of Western aid have said that we're sending enough to help Ukraine not lose, but not enough to help them in any serious victory. And this is probably, out of risk management. I mean, it is a very tricky situation against a large nuclear power like Russia, but also it's about internal organizational issues and logistics and military procurement issues that the West is having and is unable to kind of provide those weapons faster. But I think that might be changing, or we'll see. But yeah, the mostly unsuccessful counteroffensive this past year could be some type of lesson learned if they want to do this again in 2025. Right now, they don't have the ability to do so. They don't have enough capabilities in 2024. They're going to focus on defense as they should. But I think the most important thing here is to see which side can adapt faster to the realities on the ground. So it's not necessarily a lost case. It's who can adapt to the mine terrain, the drones, the anti-tank forces, the field fortifications the fastest. And that's who will have the advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zach, I would like to ask you then, do you think there was a missed opportunity for a negotiated settlement or truce or some kind of ceasefire last year? And I want to put you, like what Jeffrey Mankoff said, the country, there is a state of unpeace, permanent unpeace with Russia. From his perspective, if I put it correctly, this would not be possible, would not have been possible, but I'm interested in hearing what you would think about this.
Well, thanks, Henrik, for the question, for putting together this group, and Daniel, Suzanne, Jeff, Gustav, nice to see all of you. Look, ultimately, I think, Henrik, your question is, by definition, a counterfactual, so it's impossible to know for sure what could or could not have happened in the autumn of 2022. But there were a few things, obviously, that would have played to our advantage if we had pushed a little bit harder for a diplomatic settlement of some kind back then. Number one is that Russia would not have been so convinced the time was on its side. Now it does believe the time is on its side, and therefore it has very little reason to compromise. And then the other thing we need to remember is that Vladimir Zelensky has in the past actually demonstrated a degree of malleability when it comes to which parts of Ukraine's sovereign territory must be liberated militarily, and which parts could be subject to some kind of political process. You remember back during the Istanbul talks in the early months of the war that there was the possibility of pushing the Crimea issue off, for example, 10 or 15 years into the future. After the atrocities in Bucha and Irpin were discovered, that no longer became politically possible, and all of a sudden the goal had to be liberating all of Ukraine's territory militarily. But had political circumstances changed, for example, through a concerted American effort to change the dynamic, it's entirely possible that Zelensky could have theoretically shifted. That said, I think the talks really only could have succeeded in the fall of 2022 if two things had been the case, and I don't know if we're prepared to do either of those things. I mean, the first thing is that the U.S. really would have to take the lead in marshaling its NATO allies and also reaching out to the Russians to try to figure out what kind of package theoretically could suit all sides. And we've been very reluctant to do that because, nominally we've been defending Ukraine's agency. And of course, any ceasefire by definition would only happen if the Ukrainians agree to it. So in that sense, Ukraine's agency will always be accepted. But Putin at the end of the day is interested in making a deal with the Americans. He's not interested in making a deal with the Ukrainians. We have, sufficient evidence over a long amount of time that, Putin and his clique basically think that Ukraine is some kind of fake country, dysfunctional state, and there's no need to reach out to them. What he's interested in is the photo op and dealing with Biden. And that's been a difficult thing for us to make a reality in terms of our policy. The second issue is that we've been unwilling actually to talk about some of the core principles of the European security order that Russia ostensibly, cited as its rationale for invading Ukraine in the first place. And that would involve, for example, the status of Ukraine and the right of Russia as a so-called great power in determining the security orientation of states on its border. Doesn't mean we have to agree to Russia's position, but we haven't verily been willing to engage with Russia on that issue, not since the war, not in the months leading up to the war, or verily not really for the past 30 years. So, it's very unlikely that any talks in late 2022 could have succeeded if that continued to be our position. And it does. I agree with Jeff. I mean, it leaves us in a position now where, we have a protracted war for many, many years to come. The only problem is I don't see enough of an attempt to underline in Western circles how fundamentally unacceptable that is. A long war comes with some really dangerous and unpredictable risks of escalation that no one can entirely control, and I don't know why we should be necessarily, accepting that. Nor am I necessarily sure that we're prepared actually to raise our defense spending, from 2%, which most, in fact, countries in NATO, have been unwilling to meet that benchmark, up to, 5 or 6%, which is the Cold War type level where things have to be when the mechanisms of cooperative security collapse. So security now comes at a premium. And, as has been highlighted by other panelists so far, we thought that a victory could sort of come on the cheap. And now we're dealing with the strategic aftermath of that, and it's going to come with huge, consequences if we do, for example, determine that we have to, raise defense spending up to 6% of GDP, not just for the guns to butter question in terms of whether, populations are prepared to support that, but in terms of our ability to fight climate change, for example. I mean, this is a planetary issue right now that we're dealing with. It's the future of the human species we're talking about when it comes to the issue of climate change. Do we really need to be spending the next several decades with, spending a huge amount of money on, defense over who gets to set the norms of the European security order? That seems to me like an issue that belonged to the era of the Cold War. It certainly doesn't belong to the 21st century.
Okay, thank you, Zach. You bring me conveniently into the next part of the panel discussion, namely the future 2024, and specifically weapons production and deliveries to Ukraine. And there are, of course, two elements here: the U.S. weapons production and the European weapons production. Let's start with the United States, which has been the main military supporter. Sadly for Ukraine, the mantra is no longer "as long as it takes," but "as long as we can," and we know the reason for that. The U.S. Congress, of course. I would like to put the first question to Suzanne. Do you see a way of turning this around? What end goal for this war could Congress and perhaps even a new president in the U.S. agree to continue the flow of weapons?
Yes, well, I'm not quite sure that the U.S. is there yet in terms of having changed their goals. There's a lot of political obstacles domestically at the moment that are just making American politics look like a clown show. But in the long run, I find it improbable that the United States would abandon Ukraine by not passing more aid. This would be, if in the place of the United States, it would be a self-imposed strategic defeat, really. It doesn't make a lot of sense for the United States as a rational actor to stop giving aid to Ukraine, because it essentially is helping to weaken a strategic rival at a low cost. So, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a new strategy in the situation. Clearly, the previous strategy was not very successful. And a new strategy would probably encourage a more steady flow of aid for a longer period of time. But unfortunately, as many of the speakers have already said, it looks like it will be a long war. And as Zach said, of course, that's a terrible idea, but it's hard to change the situation. The EU on its side is probably going to commit a new long-term military aid package to Ukraine. And eventually, the United States will get organized and find a way around their political stalemate. But right now, it's important to look at the fact that Russia is outproducing NATO countries in terms of weapons capabilities. It's replacing its capabilities faster and replacing manpower faster. At this rate, it can win a war of attrition if nothing changes on the side of the West. So again, that's about changing the strategy. It's true that Biden was always saying, as long as it takes, and shifting to as long as we can it doesn't look good, for the United States, but it could also be a political slight to the Republican Party, placing blame on them, in the sense that if this doesn't work out, it's all the Republicans' fault. I mean, rhetoric is one thing, action is another. I mean, even when Trump was president, actually, this is a good example. He spoke ill of NATO the whole time, saying it was, useless and all that. But actually, during that time, he got a lot of the allies to increase their military spending, and we actually saw an increase in force posture on the eastern flank of NATO while he was president. So rhetoric is one thing, and again, action is another. And Trump, I mean, right now he's trying to get in the way of this bill that's trying to be passed in the U.S. government on the question of aid. And he's really just trying to make Biden look bad. This is all a political game. And if he were actually the president, he would probably try to turn it into a political victory and pass it because, it would make him more popular. But politics aside, it's important to discuss the end, of course. What is the end of this war? What does it look like? It just doesn't look like there is going to be an end very soon. And each side is going to continue trying to attrit the other until vulnerabilities show up in defense lines. And that's when they can conduct their maneuver attacks. So we could see a period of hot war followed by some frozen conflict. But again, it would erupt again. It's the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. That's the reality, even if American aid is reduced. And that just means that they'll end up losing without American aid. And that's a great burden for Americans to bear. But ultimately, as I was saying before, on the long term, if the United States keeps supporting Ukraine, what are they doing strategically? They're trying to rebuild a very effective combat effective force in Europe, and that would, whether or not Ukraine ends up joining the alliance, it would ultimately help the United States and European powers militarily. Thanks.
Thank you. Daniel Davis, I would like to use a term that was used in Afghanistan too, namely open-ended commitments. And it looks like what we're looking at here. How can the US public be convinced of an open-ended commitment to Ukraine?
Yeah, they can't. They're not going to be. They don't want an open-ended. I mean, we've had a lot of bad experience with that, and Americans want. And I hear lots of congressmen, especially on the Republican side, openly asking, "What is the strategy? What is the expectation? What is the end state? What are we trying to accomplish with this?" Because what the Biden administration has so far been asking is for just a dollar figure, but they're not saying what they want to attain, what the militarily attainable objectives would be, what this money is supposed to produce, etc. And without that, the people, the congressmen aren't going to support this anymore. And look, and I just think that there's a recognition, and one of the reasons why they're willing to play politics with this, and especially the Republicans trying to exploit this for their benefit on the border and policies and all that, is because they recognize that $200 billion from the U.S. and Western Europe didn't dent the line from in the last 18 months from the time Ukraine tried to go on the offensive. We gave them all this extra equipment that we had, thousands of combat vehicles from the United States in total in terms of trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, et cetera, a bunch of stuff from the European side as well. And it did not move the line at all. In fact, even what little dents that they did make during the summer are now being slowly eaten away, and Russia's continuing to move across the line of contact. But I'll tell you, I think that more people are recognizing that the war is not going to be won militarily by Ukraine. In my view, it is categorically impossible. There is no way. And the reason I say that is for two big reasons. Number one is that I think there's a misunderstanding or maybe a lack of knowledge about the manpower issue on the Ukraine side. People keep talking about how this war can go on a long time, and I know a lot in the United States say they want this to turn into a frozen conflict, or they want it to just go on a long time because it harms Russia. But that assumes that the Ukraine side can conduct a long war that doesn't go anywhere, and they can continue just shoveling men into the meat grinder and just losing casualties in the hundreds and thousands per month for no gain. And I don't think they can do that. I think that's a bad prospect, because I think at some point the morale is just going to go through the toilet. Nobody wants to sacrifice their life when they know that it's not going to do anything. It's not going to succeed. The second part of that is the Russian side, because they are absolutely committed to this. Whether anybody in the West wants to accept it or not, they are, because they view this as an existential fight too, for very different reasons. But they have the manpower to fight. I think one of the panelists just mentioned that if it's a war of attrition, Russia could win a war of attrition. And I don't mean succeed. I mean they can win the war, even if it takes many years. And I think there's a lot of evidence that Russia is prepared to go years on this, because they think that works to their benefit, and they can win a military victory over time, even if it costs them enormous in both blood and treasure. They have both. And their military capacity right now, they don't have to rely on Iran and on North Korea. That's just big benefits that they're getting, and it's huge benefits. But even domestically, they can do what Ukraine can't do, because Ukraine doesn't have the air defense capacity. Russia's relentlessly bombing their military facilities, which makes it very difficult for them to do any domestic production. And as we've already discussed, the Western and the United States production is just anemic, because it's not our security at stake. We're not promoting the resources that the Russians are, because it's their state that's at stake. So it'll take us years to get up to the level to where Russia is at already. And that's if we put in the money behind it. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to do that. So the bottom line is, I think it's vital that both the West, and primarily the United States, and even Kiev, recognize the war cannot be won militarily, so they need to have the best negotiated position they can get now and save their people, because they're going to need those men right now for their future. And the more they shovel into this meat grinder, the less they're going to have to protect themselves and to build a future once the war is over.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jeffrey Mankoff, I would like to ask you, you wrote 1 year ago an excellent essay entitled The Realest Case for Ukraine. And if I present the argument correctly, the war is a historical inflection point, and continued Western support is crucial to halt Russian imperialism. Can you elaborate whether you believe this is a strong enough narrative for the broader West to support Ukraine, or stick to the United States if you want to?
Sure. So the argument that I was making in that piece was essentially that if you look at where most self-described realists have been on this war, it's about the danger of escalation. It's about the need to build some kind of stable post-conflict security order in Europe, within which Russia plays some kind of a role. But that if you dig into the realist canon, you can draw other conclusions about what the United States and its allies should be doing in this conflict. I think realists have often struggled with the question of the role that regime type and internal politics play in determining state behavior. But that hasn't always been true. There are different, sort of strands. But I think the takeaway from the piece that I was writing is that the way that Russia is currently constructed is it's not a status quo power in Europe and Eurasia. And what happens on the ground in Ukraine is going to have an enormous impact on the ability of Russia to continue to push its revisionist aspirations vis-a-vis not only Ukraine, but in the wider region as well. So if you care about a stable balance of power, if you care about maintaining a long-term manageable security order in Europe, the first step that's necessary for that is ensuring Russia's defeat, or at the very least, a conclusion to the war that leaves Russia in a strategically disadvantageous position relative to where it was in February of 2022. And so I think part of the problem then is that, you're right, the political leadership in the West has not done a particularly effective job at communicating the stakes of this conflict. And so there is this perception that this is something that's happening far away, a faraway country about which we know little, as Neville Chamberlain talked about Czechoslovakia. But ultimately, if we want to have a peaceful and stable European security order that looks more or less like the security order that we've had in Europe since the end of the Cold War, I think this is a conflict of fundamental importance. And we may not want it to be a protracted conflict. We may not want this to be a war that goes on for a long period of time. But I also think that that's not necessarily something that we have control over. You have to adapt and work in the circumstances as they are, and not succumb to the kind of wishful thinking that we've been talking about before, that there is, an easy way to end this war, that there's a quick path to either victory or a negotiated peace that's not going to undermine those kind of fundamental interests that the United States and its allies have. And to touch really quickly on the domestic political issue, I do think that outside of some of the frontline countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we haven't done a good job about making the case about the stakes of this conflict. Now, that said, I think if you watch what's going on in the United States, you can come away with a slightly misleading picture of where the public debate lies, because there is this holdup in Congress on passing the supplemental appropriations bill that would continue to fund Ukraine into 2024. That's mostly not about Ukraine. Right, there's pretty strong cross-party agreement that this is an important issue, that the United States has a critical role to play in enabling the Ukrainians to continue to fight. The problem is that there's a lot of other things that people in Congress care about, mostly at the moment, the southern border and immigration. And you have a faction in the Republican Party that is trying to use the issue of Ukraine support precisely because it's something that the White House and a lot of not only Democrats, but their own colleagues see as being of fundamental importance. They know that it's seen as an almost existential issue to get this Ukraine support passed. So therefore, they're using it as leverage to get concessions on issues related to the southern border. So these are, in some ways, separate issues that have been tied together for domestic political purposes. And, you're even hearing now from some of the leading Republicans in Congress, like Speaker Senate Majority Leader McConnell and others, that, maybe we have to separate these things because we need to get this Ukraine supplemental bill passed. So I think there's still some internal political churning that's going to happen on the Hill before we get there. But I do think that within the Congress, there's still pretty strong cross-party support for doing this. I think if you look at public opinion polling in the United States, support for Ukraine is not as high as it was in the spring of 2022, which is normal. And there's more of a partisan split on it. And some of that is being driven by Donald Trump, but it's still pretty robust. And so I think that, there is a role that political leaders on both sides have to play in terms of making the case for why this is important. But that's, I think something that they have to do. I think a lot of the public is morally supportive of Ukraine on moral grounds, and I think is convincible politically that this is something that's important to do for American national interests. And I think you have a similar situation in Europe where the process has been, very uneven. But look, this year, 11 NATO allies are going to be above the 2% spending goal, which is a big shift compared to where we were just a couple of years ago. There are a couple more that are moving in that direction. There's increasingly talking about 2% as a floor rather than a ceiling. So I do think we're seeing a push towards much greater defense spending in a lot of European countries, including those like Germany that have been very reluctant in the past to go down that route. It's just that these are democratic states. They have complicated political processes. They need to get the public to go along with them. Russia doesn't have that. Russia's an autocratic system that's become more autocratic since the war has started. It's shifted towards economic mobilization and a kind of ideological mobilization, which I think shows greater efficacy in the short term. But as we've seen a lot of times in the past, that's not necessarily a stable equilibrium. So I think the idea that Russia can sustain a long war because it's outproducing NATO, because they see this conflict in existential terms. And, here I would say they, when we talk about Russia, can mean different things. I think that's certainly true for Putin, Patrushev, people around them in the Kremlin. I'm not sure that's true for ordinary Russians. We don't talk about the domestic political environment or domestic political constraints inside Russia, but I think they exist. And I think the longer this war goes on, the more salient those divisions become, especially as the economy continues to suffer. Inflation is becoming a big problem in Russia. Unemployment is very, very low. All of these resources are being channeled into military production. Money's being taken from social support. It's being taken from the National Welfare Fund. So Russia is capable of ramping up production and running the economy very, very hot right now. I heard somebody say a couple weeks ago, and I think this is probably right, what's going to end this war ultimately is not what happens on the battlefield, but inflation. That when the Russian economy begins to start coming apart at the seams from overheating, from the real push for mobilization, that's when you're going to start having this undermining of the domestic political consensus in Russia. And I think we're seeing some of these fissures already. And this is part of the reason I think that, there is a difference in terms of the timelines within which we can see different outcomes in this war. But a war that drags on, into 2025, 2026, I don't think favors Russia at all. Now, the question is, can the Ukrainians in the West, get to that point? And, yes, the Ukrainians are making enormous sacrifices right now. They have chosen to continue making those sacrifices. And I think at the end of the day, that is what we in the West, in the United States and in Europe have to be guided by. As long as the Ukrainians and their democratically elected government are committed to continuing this war, I think we have a sort of a moral duty as well as a strategic one to continue supporting them in doing that. And if they make the decision that they need to pursue negotiations to preserve their own domestic political order and their own people, then we have to honor that. But ultimately, this is a decision that the Ukrainians need to make for themselves.
Right. Thank you very much. The last question on this weapons supply issue goes to Gustav Gressel from getting the European perspective here. And I want to emphasize here a report from last year from the Estonian Defense Ministry that outlines how the West should boost its military production to give Ukraine the capacity to resume an offensive campaign in 2025. So probably the most ambitious document we have out there by a Western government. Gressel, in your analysis of the political thinking in the major European capitals, how would you assess Europe's ability to up the ante in terms of weapons production? And to what extent is the EU incentive, the EU chips in with some money, to what extent is that helpful to push the more reluctant allies?
Well, without EU money, we would probably go nowhere. So it's essential. The problem is it comes, of course, much too late. A lot of the defense industrial decisions should have been taken in 2022 and not by the end of 2023 and now early 2024, because they have a lead time. You don't produce a tank overnight. Companies need to be noticed, and then you can enter production. For artillery shell needs 6 to 9 months to be produced, and the Leopard 2A8, the most complex weapon system, is 3 years. European Patriots, they will take 5 years to build the factory and get the assembly line running. So that is the problem now. Of course, we wish to have taken other decisions in the past 10 years or so. Things are as they are, and it's going to be tricky. Now, the problem is it's going to be tricky, particularly this year, because, as I said, there was a kind of this illusion that the war might end quickly, and that comes from extrapolating the trend of Russian weakness that was visible throughout 2022 into kind of the indefinite. But linear trends in war never progress linearly. People have agencies and do something about it. The Russian armed forces and the Russian war economy saw what the weaknesses are, try to fix them. But so can and so will we. The problem is, of course, the time that takes will be daunting. The second thing is the Trump effect. Last year, for example, Europe built more than 650,000 artillery shells, but unfortunately only 300,000 went into Ukraine. Where did the rest go? Well, countries are stockpiling up again for their own defense. The Finnish are the only ones who have admitted to do so by now, but the others do the same. In this year, Europe will produce between 1.2 to 1.8 million artillery rounds in total. But if everybody panics that it might soon face a Russian invasion on its own, the question is how much of that will go to Ukraine? Will we see a similar weak ratio like last year? Or will confidence in the US system and US commitments to Europe and Article 5 allow us to ship more, or put people into the subjective perception they can ship more? That is, of course, something that is crucial to see. Now, on the thing, sort of Russia never-ending warfare, well, Russia is burning down the stockpile of Soviet equipment the Soviet Union took decades to build up. They can, of course, burn this down until roughly 2027 and 2028 at the current rate of fighting, but then it's gone. They have no chance replenishing that. And that is the big problem. Our stockpiles of equipment are thinner. I always get angry when people throw around billions and billions and billions spent, because these billions are equivalents of newly produced tanks, but we don't give Ukrainian newly produced tanks. We give them, by and large, old Soviet-era equipment and a bit of global war on terror leftovers, MRAPs, etc. These billions, they are a bit fake, but okay. Of course, our depots are slimmer, but our industrial base is wider. So at the end, it clings on the decision, are we willing to open the books and order new stuff so that Ukraine can get new equipment? And these decisions, again, it's a matter of time. You can't buy military equipment on Amazon. And defense procurement, bureaucratically speaking, is not the fastest affair. But there is, of course, we have to act quickly on this, but it's still sort of, it's still theoretically possible. There's no thing that says Russia has to win it. On personal, yeah, Russia has more personnel. It's four times the population of Ukraine and loses 6 to 10 times as many soldiers in the war. So if Ukraine would mobilize more aggressively, they could fix the manpower issue. Of course, mobilizing more aggressively would take much more men out of a wartime economy, and you would need financial security to compensate that. And here we talk again about Congress, about Viktor Orban in the EU Parliament, etc. These are things that can be dealt with if you deal with them. If we don't deal with them, of course, they become a problem.
Thank you. I would like then to switch to stick with you, Gustav, on this, and switch to Ukraine. From the Ukraine's perspective, how does this war look? Since you mentioned the fact that Ukraine might have to mobilize a lot of men. There have been numbers about coming up in the media about 500,000 men and women. What the Ukrainian army has asked President Zelensky for. What would these additional men and women supposed to? What would be their function? Presumably not counteroffensive then, but to keep the strategic defensive of. How do you see this? And maybe as a follow-up to that, do you think the battlefield technology on the battlefield would continue to favor defensive warfare over offensive in the year to come?
So the first is easy to answer. They will basically relieve people who have been constantly at war for 2 years. They would generate a larger pool of forces to rotate forces, because the problem is forces, the formations that are fighting are tired. The second thing is they, as I said before, they have a very uneven state of training, especially among specialist officers. And you can't train a formation while it is deployed at the front. You need to pull it out, put it in the rear, retrain them, retrain officers and specialists to other standards, and then you can send them back again. If you have insufficient forces to do that, and you have insufficient forces to properly rotate your units, that creates a problem. And the general staff, looking into long war, they want to have sufficient pool of people to rotate forces. The second thing, technology. For the time being, yes, both parties are extensively trying to adapt, both technologically but also tactically, how to sort of create new formations that it's still combined arms warfare, but the combined arms mix looks very different than our classical Fulda Gap mechanized brigade. And this happens both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. Ukrainians call these new force brigades, dubbed. The Russians call them reconnaissance assault brigades. Both are basically have a high degree of drone warfare components, have organic electronic warfare equipment dialed down to lower levels. They have different ways of combat management, and they try out these new formations, whether they're effective or not. Both parties skip what has proven not effective and sort of improve on what has been effective. On that notice, the Russians are extensively fiddling now in their Kupiansk offensive and different employment of electronic warfare means, and that is very much connected to that. And the thing is, I can't guarantee you who will be first, who managed to overcome current technical obstacles towards offensive maneuver warfare. That's a bad thing to do, because it might well be the Russians, then we are in a bad place. It might be the Ukrainians, then we are happy. The thing, of course, for defense planners, if you don't know which case it's going to be, better plan for the worst case, because if you prove for the worst case, you will manage the good case as well. Other way around, it doesn't work.
Thank you very much. I would like to switch to how does it look on the Russian side by asking Jeffrey Mankoff a question. Russia has the material upper hand in terms of weapons manufacturing, but is it possible to speculate the amounts in human losses would make Russia tone down or abandon its war aims? Mm-hmm. Basically, how brutal is Russia willing to pursue its foreign policy goals in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's a question to which we don't entirely know the answer. And again, there's a difference between different Russians. So we can assume that the Kremlin is willing to sacrifice an almost endless number of Russians to achieving its foreign policy goals. But the Kremlin is not the only actor in Russia that matters. And I think that there is a limit to what the public is willing to endure, both in terms of the economic costs, but perhaps most importantly in terms of the human costs. And we've seen this in numerous Russian wars in the past, especially imperial wars of aggression, where the survival of the state's not at stake. There's this kind of cult of victory of World War II that the Putin regime has really cultivated and sought to lean into. But in a lot of ways, I think that's a misleading analogy, because in World War II, it was the Soviet Union that was being invaded and that faced these truly existential stakes, whereas today that's not true. And this is a war that looks much more like the Russo-Japanese War, or World War I, or the Crimean War, where Russians are being asked to fight and die for the imperial ambitions of an out-of-touch regime. So to what extent are they willing to continue doing that? I don't think we know the answer, but I think it's reasonable to suspect that there is an upper limit to what that is. And again, we've seen instances of at least limited mobilization against these kind of pressures. Soldiers' mothers, on the one hand, echoing something that we saw during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And it's, even though the official Soldiers' Mothers Committee has been dissolved, we've seen the mothers and other family members of soldiers being protesting, and the Kremlin trying to sort of treat them with kid gloves because it knows how explosive that issue potentially is. Just in the last couple of weeks, we saw significant demonstrations in Bashkortostan, a republic on the Volga that is significantly non-ethnic Russian. And a lot of the tensions have to do with the disproportionate burden that non-ethnic Russians are being asked to play in this fight. They're being called up and deployed at a disproportionate rate, whereas the populations, especially of the major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, have been largely spared. So those ethnic tensions, I think, are very much there. And I think the Kremlin is very worried about the potential for unrest to develop among the younger population, and the more globally integrated population, I suppose, which is one of the reasons that they've held back on really pushing mobilization writ large of the population. Conscription, haven't done a second wave of conscription after the one that they carried out in September of 2022. And at the same time, while they have had a relatively light hand when it comes to recruiting people for the war from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some of the other cities. So I think the Kremlin is cognizant of the fact that there is this latent opposition or protest potential. They've been trying to dance around it, but at some point, if they want to continue fighting this war the way they've been fighting it and enduring the losses that they've been enduring, they're not going to have a choice but to do that and then face the potential consequences as far as domestic stability is concerned.
Similar question to you, Suzanne. To what extent do you see Russia's foreign policy goals shifting as a consequence of like the military logic and the domestic politics?
Yeah, well, there's lots to say about that. I mean, Putin has some ways to kind of maintain public support. So he's also, providing lots of, let's say, funds to the families of lost soldiers. There's been kind of an elite redistribution. You're seeing overall support still today, according to polls. And this is also because of this kind of new soft power strategy that he's using on the media, but also as a national narrative, that this war is existential. It's a war against the West at large. It's gaining a lot of momentum in that sense, and they managed to recruit 500,000 soldiers, so they say, without mobilization. So at this stage, it is still something that's supported, but there have been there's a bit of evidence that some people are talking about, negotiations and talks, but there's a caveat for that, because it's negotiations on the, just in the sense that Russia can still keep its newly acquired territory. So it's not exactly negotiations to do anything differently. It's just stop the war, but don't give back any of the land. So that also shows that, the population does support that move. But then again, it's still the war, if it carries on the way that it's going on right now, and there's not too many gains made this year, for example, it's true that the population is going to start wondering, why is this going on so long, and why is nothing happening as a result? So no society is immune to war fatigue, no matter how you spin it. There's economic issues, but at the same time, Russia has plenty of other trading partners and lots of countries that are helping it avoid sanctions. So their economy has really bounced back from any sanctions regime and seems to be fine. But there is the issue, of course, of inflation, which eventually will catch up to the society. But of course, the Russians, they evolve in their war aims, because it's about the capabilities and capacity to achieve the goal. Is it a realistic goal? And they have shifted. So of course, in the beginning, it was decapitate the regime in Kyiv, and that didn't work. So they evolved. And second stage was, okay, let's try to take the Donbass, and that's what's going on right now. And so there is a military logic to their actions. So if their wartime production right now of weapons continues to outpace us, if we don't, step up the military production, then there could be a new military logic, which is, we have the upper hand. There is no reason for us to not take more land. Why just stop there when we can feasibly take more? So yeah, it really depends on what they are capable of doing. And just considering the fact that the relations between the West and Russia have deteriorated so much that they're at an all-time low, it's almost essential for both sides to prepare for the worst case scenario. Not saying it will necessarily happen, but it could. And because you're in wartime, you have to prepare for it. So NATO, and Russia, they're ramping up production to be able to, in the event of a larger war, be able to confront one another. There's no more trust. That's the problem. It's over. In the beginning of the war, perhaps there was a possible solution to end it early, but at this stage, it's just so heavy, everything that's gone on, so many lives lost, so much at stake. It just doesn't look like there'll be any normalization of relations soon. And you kind of need a little bit of normalization to end it pragmatically. So Russia, at this rate, military logic is probably on its side if we don't switch the strategy. They might win the war of attrition. So that's really something to think about as we, enter into 2024 and plan for the future prospects of this war. Thanks.
Thank you. Then we get to the last round of questions to panelists, and we have around 10 minutes to cover this, and then we'll take questions from our online audience. So please, if you haven't already done so, please write your questions, and then we'll try to take a few of them. And the last issue is the possibility of a ceasefire or some kind of truce. And I think the question goes to Zach. How do you see the prospect for the war could end? And is it possible while Zelensky remains president? Is there any prospect?
I don't think, first of all, let me just thank all my co-panelists. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. I don't think that there's much chance in 2024 for a ceasefire for some of the reasons that have already been stated. The Russians think that time is effectively on their side. They see the fact that, Western countries have been hesitant to continue supplying Ukraine. They've also been hesitant to provide Ukraine with credible security guarantees or even a path to credible security guarantees. And for all those reasons, they think that time is on their side. So I think the best case scenario is for a ceasefire of some kind would probably be in early 2025. The issue regarding whether or not something's possible while Zelensky is still in office is that I think that up until the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive, intra-Ukrainian unity has been based on the notion that a fully fledged victory against Russia is possible. Now that no longer appears to be the case as a result of the counteroffensive's failure to achieve at least its primary goal, you're starting to see politics return to Ukraine. And that means that there are going to be political costs greater to Zelensky than before for any potential compromise. He's going to have to defend against, for example, a political challenge from Zaluzhny, or just in general, the reality that there's going to be, if not a sizable majority, then at least a plurality of Ukrainians for a very long time who are going to be against any sort of compromise with the Russians. So I think we need to keep all of that in mind. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, in some respect, try to, put together the pieces, to assemble the pieces, for a potential ceasefire at some point, because if the window of opportunity does come, it might be fleeting and we have to be prepared. So that means doing lots of things. It means continuing to demonstrate our resolve in supporting the Ukrainians, and then, offering them a path to credible security guarantees when the time is right. I think there's no time like the NATO summit in Washington this summer to have a serious discussion about that. But it also means having some private and very discreet discussions with some folks in Moscow about what a comprehensive package that the Russians might be able to accept could look like, and certainly not to go public with any of that until there's a sizable package that's actually agreed. And you can do both of those things at the same time, and some of those processes might fail. Not everything's going to be successful, but the more parallel tracks you establish, the more of a chance you have that some of them will stick and enough stars will align for a ceasefire to take place when an opportunity arises. So that's been the issue, I think, so far, is there hasn't been enough will to experiment and just to talk about certain things, because if you're limiting your policy options, if you basically don't agree to discuss at least in private, through very discreet channels, the panoply of issues that are at stake. And it is really a panoply of issues. Too often we hear that this issue is purely about Ukraine, its sovereignty, its independence, its territorial integrity, its right to choose whether or not to join Western institutions. In reality, it's about a lot more than that. It's also about the future of the European security order, longstanding issues that have plagued Russia-West relations. These debates are all layered within one another. It's also about the future of Russia, of course, and what kind of country Russia wants to be vis-a-vis its neighbors and vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis the international order more broadly. So dealing with all these things is complex. Some of these things only the Russians can deal with and answer themselves, but in other things, we can shape the security environment and the political environment in a way that could be more favorable to our interests. And so absolutely, there's going to be a deterrence component there, but there's also a diplomacy component, and you can't engage only in one at the expense of the other.
Thank you. Jeffrey Mankoff, would a frozen conflict along the line of contact be sufficient to show to Russia and other imperial-inspired countries in Eurasia that empire probably is not the bright avenue to walk down? How do you see like a truce? This seems like a middle solution, right? No one is really happy about how it goes, but we have to accept the reality as it is. It's like a middle way. How does it look for empires, including China?
Yeah, well, I think it all depends on the terms and the timing, but a ceasefire along the current lines, I think, would communicate a message that empire pays, because it would mean that Russia's retained significant amounts of territory that it seized not only in 2014, but since the start of the war in 2022 as well. And I think that is one of the reasons why, this is a war that's not just about pieces of land along the Black Sea coast in Ukraine, but it's about larger questions of the security order in Europe, but also at the global level. I do think that China is and other revisionist powers are watching what goes on in Ukraine. One of the reasons I think that Russia actually launched this war in 2022 was looking at the success of its partner of a type, I suppose, Azerbaijan, in framing the status quo on the ground by using military force to retake Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. And so the idea that facts on the ground can be changed through military force, that offensive operations with current technologies are possible, and that the international community is going to accept those kind of things. And I think, the Azerbaijan-Armenia case is more complicated for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into, but I think the fact that it happened the way that it did communicated a certain message to Russia and that if Russia is able to succeed in a similar way, that will communicate a message to others as well. First and foremost, China, but not only. We're seeing various cracks in the ideas of a liberal world order based on states' territorial integrity and sovereign equality and the inviolability of borders. And I don't think that any step to sort of ratify or legitimate those kind of activities is something that we want to be in a position of doing. Now, military logic may at some point dictate that we don't have a choice, but I don't think we're there yet. I think the problem with the notion of a ceasefire right now is that neither Russia nor Ukraine is in a position where they think that they have more to gain from a ceasefire than they do from continuing the war. And as long as that's the case, the prospects for any kind of a negotiated solution, I think, are going to be very, very hard. The politics of this are very tricky for Ukraine, in part because of everything that's happened, because of all of the devastation and the suffering that Ukraine has endured since the start of this conflict. One of the panelists mentioned before the talks that were going on in Istanbul in the spring of 2022 about a potential ceasefire, and then were derailed by the discovery of Russian atrocities in places like Bucha and Irpin. Well, multiply that by all of the other losses now that Ukraine has suffered since the spring of 2022, and it gets very hard to construct a political foundation for ceasefire talks in a democratic Ukraine. Whether it's Zelensky or anybody else, right, as a democratically elected leader, that person is going to have to be in a place where he or she is operating on the basis of public support. And right now, the public support in Ukraine for that kind of an outcome is not there, and nor is it there in Russia. So again, I think whether we like it or not, are sort of in the scenario where we're stuck with a long war, and we should do what we can to prepare for that reality.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will now go into the questions and answers. 10 minutes we have left only, so I'll go straight into the questions here. One question from William Seymour. I think I'll put this to Gustav. Seems like a question that you would be able to answer. To what extent do you see Ukraine's efforts as important, their ability to implement Western-style reforms on its path to EU integration and also for its path into NATO?
Well, of course, they're important. They're important, especially in all the administrative realms, in the defense sector, especially logistics organization. However, when it comes to the war fighting, I would caution against the notion that Ukraine only has to train like NATO and then everything will be fine. NATO hasn't fought a major state adversary like Russia for, well, ever, and it didn't try so for the last 30 years. And military technology evolved, doctrine has evolved, our societies have evolved. Actually, Russians also discovered that day by day. They don't have the mass that the Soviet Union had to throw into offensives and breakthroughs. And so a lot of the ways how we will fight probably the next war, at least if it's a land war, if it's a naval air campaign like East Asia, it's going to look very different from what we see now in Ukraine. But the embarrassing thing is, on warfighting itself, we might discover we have to learn a lot of things from Ukrainians, because they have tested and tried nasty, tricky things that we should not go unprepared into if we ever have a great power war.
Thank you. I will take another question from our online audience. I will give it to Suzanne, and maybe also Jeff, if you want to comment on it. What is your analysis of the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Broad question, maybe not an easy answer.
Yeah, of course, not an easy answer. I mean, there's a lot of strange things that happened. First of all, I'm not one for conspiracies and all that, but I just, the fact that the original Hamas attack took place on Vladimir Putin's birthday didn't escape me. It was, in a sense, it was a little bit of a gift. Not saying that that was done on purpose, there's no proof, but politically, this conflict has helped Putin, because as soon as that happened, we stopped talking about Ukraine on television. The media was completely shifted over to talking about the conflict in the Middle East. And it's the United States now has another area to worry about, another conflict to worry about supporting, its partners in. And this is probably only going to keep happening, right? We're in a conflictual world with increasing challenges in the 21st century. We've got world powers that are completely different from an identity and interest perspective that are now capable of defending their interests because they have the means. That might not have been the case in the 90s, for example. So now that that's going on, the United States really needs to prioritize its areas of strategic interests. There very well might be a situation where the war in Ukraine continues, the war with Hamas continues, and then something happens maybe in Taiwan or elsewhere that the United States will have to deal with simultaneous conflicts at the same time. And that's partially why what the US chooses to do in Ukraine is important in terms of the message that it sends to its adversaries. Because, if the United States is not up for the challenge of one conflict, it'll certainly not be up for the challenge of 2 or 3. And in a world where, the Russia-Chinese, I don't want to say axis, but partnership, along with their ideas for a different, let's say, global configuration, let's say financial institutions and just to render the dollar less dominant and American hegemony less of a controlling factor around the world. These conflicts, if not approached in the way that would benefit the United States, will inevitably give the upper hand to other actors, such as them. So if anybody else wants to add something to that, it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Jeffrey, do you have something to add on this question?
Sure. I'll just add one thing, I guess, which is that Russia and Iran have had their fates increasingly tied together, both by the conflict in Ukraine and now by events in the Middle East. So for a long time, Russia was trying to play a sort of balancing role in the Middle East, and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel had a kind of special relationship with President Putin. And Russia sought to be the actor that could reach out to and talk to everybody in the Middle Eastern context. So both Israel and Iran, Turkey and the Kurds, Israel and the Palestinians. And that is still true to some degree, but we've really seen a tightening of the Russia-Iran axis as a result. And I think that accounts for Russia's behavior since the Hamas attacks in October. And we've seen it with the increasing supply of Iranian drones, in particular, to the fight in Ukraine. So in that sense, these two actors are becoming more aligned, and the two conflicts are linked in the sense that, they are becoming mutually reinforcing. I think Russia has come around more to supporting Iran's strategic objectives in the Middle East, even at the expense of its relationship with Israel, while Iran has increasingly injected itself into the war in Ukraine through the provision of drones and potentially other supplies as well. And as we see deepening military cooperation around things like Russia's now selling fighter aircraft to Iran, cooperation around developing ballistic missiles, I think there's a danger that we're going to see a greater fusing of both the military capabilities and the strategic planning or coordination between these two revisionist actors.
Yeah, interesting. The last question we are able to take because of time is, I'll put it again to Gustav. The question is, how is the Ukraine war affecting European strategic autonomy? We have, it's a 3-minute answer.
It buried it and resurrected it at the same time. So it buried it in the sense that strategic autonomy and the predecessors usually were, and I'm simplifying things here, sorry for the French colleague, as a kind of French anti-American project. The Americans are doing bad and we could do better, and that's what we do now. And we want you other Europeans second what we think of the world, and then things will be fine. And this went nowhere, and basically the war buried it. but it resurrected it at the same time as people grasp with the magnitude of a potential Pacific War. If here China and the US are slugging it out, there will be no America, or not much of an America, that is left in Europe militarily. Of course, nuclear deterrence will still be there. Some command and control functions will still be there, but boots on the ground will not. Munition production will not. So the notion that you can then, for your own security, sort of lean back on the American eagle and things will be fine, this is gone. And this is gone with countries who were always transatlantically minded, or reluctant to any form of Gaullism, like Poland, which is arming up, like, you know, at quite a pace, etc. So in that kind, it has resurrected strategic autonomy, not like an anti-American project, but as a strategy to supplement. The other thing is, of course, people are enormously nervous about Donald Trump. People have, with all the sort of concepts of order for international order and regional order that Russia and China express, we have, of course, the direct hand experience, a European order based on spheres of influence and the prohibition of interference by external powers. This was actually already put into legal textbooks. I have one here. It's German, but it is called Greater Spheres of Influence under International Law. And if you hold in the subtitles, and the prohibition of intervention by external powers, if you discard United Kingdom and replace it with America, and if you exchange Poland for Ukraine, it's exactly what Putin says in all his speeches, and it's Carl Schmitt. And this was basically the justification, the German foreign policy for justification in going into the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and hammer out spheres of influence with the Soviet Union. So people feel reminded of these days, and it's not sort of, the strategic debates in Europe now are not like Iraq or Libya, where you kind of have a debate of ambition. What do you want there? And if you don't want anything there, you can still be neutral and bail out. Now it's a discussion of urgency. You can't bail out. It's your continent.
All right. On that historical note, we hope our panel has inspired you listeners out there. This is the biggest war in Europe since World War II. Important to keep the expert discussion going as it develops, necessary for reaching a higher level of understanding of its dynamics for policy purposes. We hope this has been a contribution to that effort. This recording will be available on the IPD website and our YouTube channel. We invite listeners to follow our social media accounts and IPD newsletters for updates on future roundtables. And not least, we are deeply grateful for our panelists for having agreed to appear online today in our webinar. Thank you, Gustav. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Zach. Also, thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Looking forward to next time.
Bye. Thank you.